Brittle with Relics concludes, the main narrative of the book concludes here, September the 19th, 1997, when Wales voted in favour of partial devolution. On stage, Dafydd Wigley, Peter Hain, in the middle, the architect of devolution, Ron Davies, Wyn Griffiths, and Richard Livesey. As you all doubtless know, it's become something of a cause célèbre in the history of British electoral events. The vote in favour of devolution was, I think, to this day still the narrowest in British electoral history. The winning margin was fewer than 1%, and the majority in favour of, is that right, Richard? 1%, would you say?
I thought it was 0.3%.
Yeah, definitely less than 1. The winning number of votes was 6,721. So, and the number of people who voted in favour of devolution was roughly half the current population of Mountain Ash. I wanted to conclude with this moment because I think the narrowness of that victory tells us so much about what Wales felt like at the time, what it told us about our sense of who we were, about our sense of self-confidence, and about our ability to take control over our own destiny. So the first thing I did was examine the areas in Wales that did in fact vote in favour of devolution. Perhaps unsurprisingly, what we sometimes know as the Fro Cymraeg, the Welsh-speaking heartland, voted in favour of devolution. So that's Gwynedd, Ceredigion, Carmarthenshire, Anglesey as well voted in favour. Carmarthenshire, of course, the constituency where Gwynfor Evans became the first Plaid Cymru MP. So in the areas of Wales where we have Lampeter, Bangor, Aberystwyth University, where Plaid has tended to historically do well electorally, where Cymraeg is still the dominant language, that western half of Wales voted in favour of devolution. The one part of West Wales that didn't vote in favour of devolution was Pembrokeshire, a county a friend of mine always refers to as Vichy Wales. Interestingly, another part of Wales, another heartland, also voted in favour of devolution, and that was the former industrial heartland of the valleys. So Blaenau, Bridgend, Caerphilly, Rhondda Cynon Taf, Merthyr, Port Talbot, and Swansea all voted in favour of devolution. The majority in Swansea was only 5%. But those were areas that by 1997 had obviously suffered a great deal during the process of deindustrialisation, but perhaps also had something of a shared folk memory of the tradition of the miners' institutes, the welfare halls, the historic bond between the community, its workforce, and participatory democracy, the rich sense of autodidacism, of communal activity, and people who'd had direct experience of the power of participatory democracy to change their circumstances. So I trace these two identities, these two energies through the book. At this point, I always point out those aren't the only identities, of course, in Wales. There's 3 million plus people living here in Wales. There's 3 million plus Welsh identities. But and also somewhere like Blaenau Ffestiniog, where Cymraeg was the dominant language. Labour was in power for a long time. And the Labour minutes in Blaenau were written down in Cymraeg. Similarly, J.W. Griffiths, one of the most influential politicians in Wales, was from the Amman Valley near Ammanford and was a Labour politician who only spoke Cymraeg until he was, I think, 5 or 6 years old. So I don't want to divide the country into two convenient halves, but I did examine where the yes vote was carried, and it was in these two halves of Wales. And through the book, I traced the sort of social energy of these two parts of Wales. The Ifro Cymraeg, the Welsh-speaking parts of Wales, the energy that began there in the early 60s to ensure first the survival, then the revival, and then even the renewal of Cymraeg was, the book argues, a youthful energy, often an irreverent energy, often a student-led energy. The participants were happy to be jailed, to be irreverent, to take direct action. And that's an energy from the 60s up until devolution that was flowing in one upwards direction. The other energy in the book is inevitably an energy that's dissipating as Wales's relationship to industry starts to decline from the mid-60s onwards. And so that's an energy going in another direction. But somehow, both these energies meet in the morning of September 19th, 1997. Some very brief autobiography. This is the farm, the Naiad, where my mother's family was from, in Garnant, in the Amman Valley. They spent their whole lives living in Cymraeg, as well as farming. They were, my grandfather was a miner here at the Raven Colliery in Garnant, so they were very much part of that mixed industrial agricultural economy that was quite typical of the anthracite coal seam in Carmarthenshire. This is the other side of my family. This is my father's side of the family, also, I think it's self-evident, involved in agriculture. This is father's side of the family from near Chepstow, never spoke a word of Cymraeg, never really wanted to admit to being Welsh, were convinced they lived in this mythical land called Monmouthshire. And growing up in Newport in the 1980s, I encountered that atmosphere regularly, particularly singing in the cathedral choir. Very strange people who wanted to really live via HTV West and BBC West and never point their aerials towards Cardiff. So I was very aware of this sort of ability for all of us in Wales to feel these sort of dualities of identity. I particularly like this picture because my forefathers look like a bunch of hoodlums. So going back to those two energies, the obvious starting point for the renewal of Cymraeg was the Saunders-Lewis speech Tangiad Raith Cymraeg, broadcast on the BBC radio in 1962, in which Saunders-Lewis maintained that unless revolutionary action was undertaken, Cymraeg would wither and die. Within 6 months, Cymraeg had been formed, the Welsh Language Society, and within 9 months, the clearances had begun here at Capel Celyn. We obviously all know what happened at Tryweryn. The flooding began in 1965, 3 years after Saunders-Lewis' speech. But in those 2 or 3 years after that speech, with the founding of Cymdaithiais, the politics of Cymdaithiais begin to emerge, the politics of non-violent direct action. But it's the trauma of the flooding of the valley did create the energy and the conditions for which Cymdaithiais could then start to organise and articulate what they were fighting for. So Capel Celyn was flooded in 1965, and then a year later, in industrial South Wales, we have the cataclysm of Aberfan, again something with which we're all familiar. I think one of the things that's so powerful about this photograph by David Hearn is that we're seeing we're seeing the site of the destruction through these two children. They're obviously bearing witness to the disaster and the trauma that has unfolded. But I think with hindsight now, we can also say that they are bearing witness to a fracture in their community and many communities like Aberfan with the state, with the employer, in the case of Aberfan, the National Coal Board. The lives that their parents lived, or the community in which they lived, the working lives of the people there, the life of assured continual employment in a form of industry in South Wales was coming to an end. So as well as the horror, they're also witnessing the end of that contract between industrial South Wales and the people who ran British industry. The year after Aberfan, 1966, was among the years of highest employment in Britain in the 20th century, a time when working conditions and employment and wages were high. And I think Aberfan symbolises the end of that moment. Around the time of Aberfan, a year or two later, the works of both Martin Luther King and Gandhi were translated into Cymraeg and had a huge impact on cymdeithiaeth and how they went about this form of direct action. Here, dismantling street signs which are written in English in Welsh-speaking areas. One of the things I like about this photograph is, if you squint, this could be Chicago in 1968, or indeed Paris during les événements. Like other young people engaging in civil disobedience across the world at this time in the late 60s, these activists have great hair and a great sense of purpose. But we also need to bear in mind, talking about the horrors of Aberfan, that in the late 60s in Wales, we did also experience what Harold Wilson famously called the white heat of scientific revolution. This is BP Llandarcy. When we think of industry in South Wales, I think we tend to think of coal and coke-faced miners coming out of the lift cage looking shattered and exhausted and broken and sweaty and dirty. This is a clean working environment, clean lines, technology, investment, and a very high standard of working conditions. BP Llandarcy by 1960 was the third biggest refinery in Britain. And it was a place that could easily host 3 cricket teams, 3 football teams, 3, possibly even 4 rugby teams. It had a famed athletics centre, squash courts, canteens where there are obviously hierarchies for the workforce. But this was a place where people went to work and they weren't merely paid for their labour. They were trained and they worked around extraordinarily high level of amenity. And of course, a place like BP Llandarcy also produced mechanics, engineers, bricklayers. The resources a place like this produced were felt right across the community. My mother taught in Ebbw Vale Grammar School in the mid-60s, and she said it was the happiest school she ever taught at, and one of the most successful experiences she had as a teacher. And as someone who grew up in South Wales in the 1980s, to associate places like Ebbw Vale or Llandarcy or the area around there with prosperity was quite a mental leap to take. But somewhere like BP Llandarcy was somewhere where people were paid well, and the resources there meant that the community had an extraordinary high sense of its own worth. BP Llandarcy started to stop producing. The peak of its production as a refinery was 1975, the year after the year or two after the OPEC oil crisis, and shortly after the 1972-1974 miners' strikes. Obviously now, looking back at this era, we realise from an environmental perspective, coal, steel, oil, the industries in which South Wales relied for employment were not without their problems. This photograph was taken in 1973, and it's of CAT, Centre of Alternative Technology, Mlynedd, established in 1973 by environmentalists. I am 95% sure of this fact. I have checked with 4 different people, 3 of whom are in this photograph. But I think what's interesting about it is this photograph taken in Mlynedd in 1973, there are no Welsh people. These are all people who've moved to the area, excited by the idea of working in environmentalism and working at the centre. Around 1973-74, Britain experienced inward migration for the highest levels post-war, especially in rural areas. So the rural population of Britain actually increased in the early 70s. And Wales was, and up until the pandemic, I would have probably said is, still a cheap place for people to move to, compared to other property values in rural Britain. Canolfan Davies, who ended up being on the board of CAT, makes the point in the book that we've lived with this contradiction in Wales since the late 60s, that people have moved here and with wonderful ideas about environmentalism, but there has been an element of us being lectured to by people who move to Wales, who want to do dynamic things like produce solar and wind power. But at the same time, of course, we in Wales really do rightly celebrate our environmental ability. I think we're currently the 3rd best country in the world at recycling. And obviously the first devolved government paid quite a lot of attention to the notion of sustainability, which is a sort of roundabout way of saying I think we owe quite a lot to the hippies. But I'd also say that people who moved here then in the early 70s probably moved here wanting to have a Welsh life, or their idea of what a Welsh life constituted. And who's to say that their idea of one was any worse, better, stranger than anyone else's? The one thing I'd also say is I'm aware that people who moved here, and people I speak to in the book, say that they were moving to poor areas, and even if they had limited means to buy one of the many disused outbuildings, small holdings, set of cottages that were freely available during the early 70s, they did have the means to acquire those places, whereas local people did not. Moving through the 70s up until this point now in 1980. Obviously in 1979, Conservative government was elected, and was elected on a programme of proposed deindustrialisation. This photograph was taken within a year of that government coming to power, less than a year of it coming to power, March or April 1980. And this is at Shotton, the British Steelworks. And in the space of 3 hours, 6,500 people were made redundant in one steelworks. in a very small community right in the northeast of Wales. At the time, it was the largest mass redundancy in Western Europe. And I think this photograph shows people experiencing the sheer trauma of being on the front line of the shockwave of deindustrialization. I don't need to tell any of you how tough Welsh women are, and people who work for a living in communities of what governments don't seem to be high net worth. These are people in this photograph who know the cost of everything and indeed the value of everything too. And what you're seeing on these faces are people wondering not only where their next job's going to come from, but where's the money going to come for the hairdressers, for the Christmas club, for the family clothes. These are people, as I said, experiencing trauma. And while I think we can all agree that deindustrialization was perhaps inevitable given the relationship to industry, the speed with which it happened and the shock and awe with which it happened is etched onto the faces of these women. And at the start of the 1980s, at the start of the mass redundancies, we also started burning buildings in Wales. This is a farmhouse near Canolfan. It belonged to a clergyman, which I include to illustrate the indiscriminate nature of the campaign. But throughout the Maybe on Glyndŵr campaign of burning second homes, there was in Wales a slim majority in favour of the campaign. That majority was predicated on the absolute condition that no one was hurt, no human life was hurt or damaged, or no one was injured. If the damage was just to property, there was always a majority in favour. The campaign lasted for the best part of 15 years. There was only one person to be prosecuted in association with it, was prosecuted around 1993, and that was in relation to a postal bomb. It wasn't in relation to the campaign of arson on second homes. In the book, I speak to some people who have what I might call a close working knowledge of the methods used in the campaign. But to this day, the sense of mystery, of anonymity surrounding it, I think speaks to the extent to which there was an understanding that something had to be done to address the crisis of rural housing. We now in Wales are, in my lifetime, having to deal with this crisis all over again. Many of us are witnessing history repeat itself. I sincerely hope we never reach this stage of criminality again. But there's no arguing with the fact we, particularly in rural areas, but by no means only rural areas, we are in crisis with housing. In amidst all the doom and gloom, we did get some things very right in the 1980s in Wales. The WDA, the Welsh Development Agency, which used to boast a great deal about attracting the greatest per capita amount of inward investment for individuals in Wales, was charged with sort of trying to address the problems of unemployment brought about by deindustrialization. Many of the companies that attracted with that inward investment, Sony, Panasonic, Sanyo, Hitachi, are no longer present in Wales. It was something of a sticking plaster solution, depending on who you speak to. But certainly, in terms of long-term economic development, I don't think you can point to many successes. However, it did have a huge success in the re-landscaping of the valleys in particular, but the former industrial environment. And the man responsible for that was a man called D. Gwyn Griffiths. And he's something, I think, of an unsung hero of this era. He really was an innovator. He had people coming from all over the world to come and do fact-finding missions to see how we'd restored the landscape in Wales and how somewhere like this could end up looking like this in the space of sometimes just a few months. Unfortunately, now we're dealing with the consequences again of our former industrial environment, and tips are once again threatening our communities. But the manner in which D. Gwyn Griffiths and his team cleared the valleys really was extraordinarily efficient and innovative, and is something we should celebrate. So, by the middle of the 1980s, we come to another cataclysm, the cataclysm of the South Wales miners' strike. In the book, this is deliberately the longest chapter, because I wanted the reader to feel a sense of endurance while listening to the voices involved in the strike. This is the Mardi Women's Support Group. Arfon Evans, the chair of the Mardi NUM Lodge, explained to me that on the day that the South Wales NUM agreed to join the strike at his pit, they all came out as one, and there was no need for a picket line. For the entire duration of the strike, Mardi didn't need a single picket because he knew no one would want to go back to work. But a community like Mardi is obviously heavily reliant on the one industry of coal, and the strength of solidarity in that community reflects that. And this picture, I think, just speaks to that solidarity. This is the Mardi Women's Support Group. These are women whose husbands or partners were denied any form of social security while they were on strike because the government maintained that the strike was illegal. The 30-year rule has demonstrated that much of the policing of the strike was in fact illegal. So quite where we decide to draw the line between what is and isn't legal in terms of talking about the strike, I think is an ongoing debate. But the resilience of the women in this picture, I think, is extraordinary, and it shows the extent to which communities, in some cases, knitted together to try and get their families through that year of great discomfort and trauma in mining communities. One of the things I really was grateful for researching the book was realizing that there was not one response to the strike across the South Wales coalfield. Each NUM lodge had its own response to the strike. So a pit like Kinhydre, which is at the far west of the anthracite coal field, not far from Carmarthen, had a huge workforce. It was one of the largest anthracite collieries in Europe at the time. And the workforce would come from 20 miles in one direction, 20 miles another direction. These were people who spoke different languages in many cases. Some people working there spoke Cymraeg, some English. And from day one, they had a huge problem with people crossing the picket line, or the vernacular they used with scabs. And they had a huge problem with the police presence there. And their response to the strike was completely different to the response of a community like Mardi. This is the Betws Lodge at Ammanford. I include this partly to show that the response to the strike was gendered. In the last picture, we saw the women's support group. Those were people who had to feed and clothe their families. And here we have the workforce. I also include this picture because I like the fact people are smiling and joking in it in the middle of the strike, and to remind ourselves that solidarity is often something we use to defend ourselves, but solidarity is also a source of collective joy. And even in this picture, in the midst of the strike, we can see flashes of that joy. Also, the TUC representative for the Betws Lodge was one Carmen Thomas, who Jane will have known because Carmen was one of the two founders for Women for Life on Earth that led the march to start Greenham Common. So one of the two founders of the march at Greenham Common was also the TUC representative here. And she said she'd come back from Greenham and go into the pick and shovel in Ammanford and talk to the miners, all of whom she knew. And even in the middle of the strike, they'd give her money to take back to Greenham for the women there. And in the introduction, Jane alluded to that sense of co-consciousness across the various campaigns for social justice in Wales at the time. And I think that's a very good example of it. This is TJ's in Newport, where I learned everything I needed to know about life. I include this because while we were all thrashing around to loud punk music, drunk on cans of out-of-date Orange Boom, above us was a homeless hostel. And the person who ran it, who's a saint, talks in the book at some length about the changes that the Care and Community Act brought about and how he had to, much against his will, he couldn't offer his clients constant shelter in the premises. Every 3, 6, 9 months they had to be released back into the community. And he tells me how two of his clients, two former steel workers in Llanwern, had to be released back into the community and sadly took their own lives by drowning in the river in Newport. But as a metaphor, visual metaphor for industrial South Wales towards the end of the 80s, at the sharp end of deindustrialisation, I think what was going both above and below stairs in this building is a very handy metaphor. Back to the genius of D. Gwyn Griffiths, he continued to make places like this look like this. I do find it eerie that couple look a little like Charles and Diana. But I include this because, out of a sense of frustration, because we created the panorama for Visit Wales, for one industry, for tourism. But what we didn't do, and it wasn't in our control at the time to do this, but what we were unable to do was work out what the people living in that community were going to do for a living, what sort of infrastructure they were going to have. What were people who were living in this community earning well below the national average income in the UK? How were their lives going to be as improved as the landscape was improved? Within the energy of Cymraeg, once we get to the mid-80s, and I should say that Cymdeithas Cymraeg did a huge amount in the miners' strike as well. They did food collections, they offered holidays for miners' children to go and have holidays in rural Wales, and indeed did a great deal for other causes like Greenham, like Nicaragua. I think one of the most astonishing interventions in the Welsh language movement was from music, and in particular from datblygu, from Patricia Morrison and David R. Edwards. And my Cymraeg is very basic, but I'm told by people who know a lot better that David R. Edwards' interrogation of Welsh identity was as piercing, as brutal, as unforgiving, and as revelatory as R.S. Thomas's was in English language. And what David R. Edwards' songs did was demonstrate that there was more to being a Welsh speaker, to being Cymraeg, than being pachus and being respectable. You didn't have to think you were defined by the Eisteddfod. You could be defined by, in his case, a very lyrical form of self-loathing. The influence of datblygu was obviously felt on people like Super Furry Animals, who covered a datblygu song on their Cymraeg album, Mwng. And by the time we get to the early 90s, it is the confidence of culture, of film, of music, of drama that's helping Wales shrug off the misery of post-industrialisation. Obviously, that's typified in the attitude and success of Super Furry Animals, but I think one of the most interesting things about this picture is if we consider where the group came from in terms of their families. So Gruff Rhys, the singer, his father, Ioan Bone Rhys, was a poet, was a language activist and campaigner, and was also a member of the Gorsedd. And on his left are Dav and Cian, two brothers, and their father was Carl Ewan Close. Sadly died not too long ago. He was one of the directors of public health in Wales. He campaigned all his life for the health of the people of Wales. He also campaigned for the health of the language, and he established Nantgrythin, the Centre for Cymraeg. He also set up Antur Alahien, which was a community-owned centre, also had a GP practice. He was an extraordinary man, one of the most charming, eloquent people I've ever met. And he also happened to be the father of two Super Furry Animals. It's a life well lived. And obviously in music, people who were vilified from coming from Blackwood in 1997 were showered with awards at the Brittle Awards ceremony. Manic Street Preachers were nominated in several categories, and they won Best Group and Best Album. In their early days, they would often take to the stage in hand-stenciled shirts with situationist slogans. It's sadly out of sight in this picture, but Nicky Wire reinstigated that tradition, and his T-shirt says, "I love hoovering." They insisted they be given the award by a Welsh person, and Colin Jackson handed them this award. And Nicky Wire gave an impromptu dedication of the award to comprehensive schools everywhere, because he said that's where the best music and the best art comes from. And he said the word art with the authority that only someone with a Blackwood accent can say it. So people who involved in the Yes to Wales campaign say in the book that things like Manic Street Preachers performing on the Jules Holland New Year's Eve television programme with a dry goch flag on their amps did a huge amount of psychological heavy lifting in the campaign for devolution. It prepared people for the idea that Wales could feel a bit of confidence about itself. So we're 25 years on. This is the Wales I live in now. Pluralistic, multiracial, a Wales that has the ambition of privileging its young people. It's typified for me in this mural of Nicole Reddy and person of colour having a wonderful attitude that's now synonymous with football in Wales. I also live in this Wales, the Wales where Gwenno, who was dragged to Clwb Ifor Bach by her Cymdaithus activist mother, and I think found the whole thing quite boring as a young girl, now has a mural dedicated to her on the wall. And as someone who speaks with such authority and confidence about what it means to be Welsh, without any sentimentality or any nervousness, but articulates a sense of who we are as an international recording artist, not just a Welsh recording artist. And inevitably, we conclude here. Iamawahid, I think in some ways the journey from Iamawahid being considered a nationalist song, something that was considered a nationalist song, has to all intents and purposes become a national anthem. And I think the journey that song's been on is perhaps the journey I talk about in the book. I also think Iamawahid's also a different type of song. I think it's a folk song. I think it's a song of the Werin. And I think in the Walgoch, we have the Pobl Werin of our time now. We have the folk people. We have the community of communities of Wales. Everyone's invited, everyone's welcome. It is a place where it's an LGBTQ place for people to stand. If women want to stand together with other women, they can stand there. The Walgoch is the best of us, and everyone's welcome, and everyone's equal. And I think we're living through something of a miracle in terms of how we feel about ourselves through football in Wales at the moment. And let's hang on to it after this World Cup, because we still don't know how it's going to go. So, to conclude, we are 25 years past that day in 1997. One of Ron Davies's key words during the referendum and leading up to the referendum was inclusivity. Well, we now have a far more inclusive government than this picture suggests. There are more women than men in the current cabinet in Wales. There are people of colour in the cabinet, in the government of Wales. But Ron created two miracles. He created the miracle of getting the legislation for devolution through Parliament. And he created the miracle of creating the conditions for a yes vote, however small. And I think it's important that we remember that within that tiny vote, those 6,721 people, is still, I think, the opportunity for us to be the society we want to be in Wales. One of fairness, mutualism, welcome, and chwarae fair play. Let's not waste that inheritance. Another phrase Ron had was, devolution is a process, not an event. Now, many of us in Wales would like more legislation. We'd like to have more say in the fiscal state of Wales. We'd like more say over our economy. But we don't have to wait for changes in the law to ensure that devolution is still a process, not an event. Processes need energy, focus, clarity to work well. Where processes fail or grind to a halt is when the timidity and the torpor that can result from institutional inertia result in a grinding down of processes. And let's not waste that inheritance. Let's not waste those 6,721 votes, a figure so close to those 6,500 people who lost their jobs in the space of 3 hours. Let's remember now, 25 years later, that now, today, more than ever, in Wales, devolution is a process, not an event. Diolch o galon.